I don't need to do a lesson today. They did it. Did you see the joy on those faces? We are so blessed. We are so blessed. You know, our fur kids, they mean a lot to us. They're cute and they're cuddly, and they're always there when we need them. And you love them. At least I do. I have 2 yellow kitties that I love. But it's not the same way that you love your siblings or how you love your spouse. And it's definitely not the way you love to watch football or to read a good book. In fact, the Greek language, which is the language in which the New Testament, the Gospels of the New Testament was originally written, has 8 different words for the word love. When it got translated in the King James Version, when it was translated from the Greek into the English, they used 1 word. And so the nuance and the flavor of the different meanings of love that are expressed in the original Gospels kind of got lost in translation. So I would like to focus on one of the types of love. If you ever want to look at it there, you can go online and there's lots of different places that'll tell you what all of them are. But today I want to talk about one particular kind of love, and that is a love that's called agape love, which scholars believe that it underpins many of the elements of the nativity story. Although there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament, only 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, have a birth story. The other 2 Gospels don't even mention the birth of Jesus. So the Gospel of Mark, which is the first Gospel that was written, and the Gospel of John, which was the last one, at least of the ones that were canonized, don't mention a birth story at all. And over time, what we've done with the 2 that we do have is we've conflated the elements of both those stories. So we have shepherds and kings and mangers and going to Jerusalem, going to Bethlehem. All of those are different in each of the 2 gospel stories, but we tend to have conflated them in the way we think of Christmas. We celebrate Christmas. We also know that these gospels were written somewhere between, at the earliest, 60 A.D., to about 90 or 95 A.D., which is at the very earliest 30 or 35 years after the death of Jesus. So these Gospels are not meant to be biography. They were not written to be biography. Truth be known, they were not written to be sacred or special. We made them sacred and special, but they were not. The intent of the people who originally wrote them was not that they were special, but rather they were written to bring comfort to a community of believers who were in turmoil at that time. You see, remember that in 70 A.D., there was a war with Rome, and it was a raging war. The temple in Jerusalem, the Jews, and the Jesus followers were Jews, and they were called the people of the temple. They no longer had a temple. There was a break in the mainline community between the Jesus followers and the people of the temple because they had to learn to define themselves differently. Who am I in this new world, and how do I define myself? That relationship was under a significant strain. And the followers of Jesus were really working and striving to find their identity in this new world order. So back to the nativity story. Mary and Joseph, travelers not welcomed. Travelers not housed nor fed. A baby born without a permanent home among the poorest of the poor. And who are the first to get the announcement of the birth? The shepherds. The declaration of a Prince of Peace being born was given to the lowest, socially, to the lowest of the low. A Prince of Peace, hope in a time of war. The hope pinned on that birth to help resolve the conflict that was existing. And who went looking for him? The Magi. Now, in our tradition, we tend to think of the Magi as kings, but they were really probably astrologers who had seen something up in the sky and went following it. But certainly they were men of status because they had access to Herod. Okay, they had access to the governor. And they not only had access to the governor, but ultimately defied the governor, who was the power structure in Jerusalem at the time, by not coming back and telling him when they found the baby, but taking a different route home. So built into these stories were a reminder that the people, the earliest followers of Jesus were not, for the most part, rich. They were not politically connected. They were members of a landless class. They were underrepresented. They lacked a coherent voice with which to address the government. But they were working at it. They were working to try and find it. But the one thing that they were was a community. That was the one thing. The historian Josephus wrote that this was one of their outstanding characteristics. They welcomed all, the poor, the hungry, the traveler, the lost, and fed and housed them without condition. They lived the law of agape love, a pure, willful, sacrificial love that intentionally desires another's highest good, which is what agape love means. The historian Tertullian remarks in his 2nd century defense of the Christians, and the writing is called the Apology, and that's another mistranslation, because it doesn't mean I'm sorry. It's just an explanation. Apology in Greek means an explanation. Okay. That Christian love that was expressed by the Jesus community attracted pagan attention. The pagans noticed, and this is his quote, "What marks them in the eyes of their enemies is their loving kindness. Only look, they say, look how they love one another." Agape love, which is most often thought of as the highest form of Christian love, is the kind of love in action that shows empathy, extends desire for the good of the beloved, wants the best, extends the personality, demonstrates good intentions, and is intended for everyone. No exceptions. No exceptions. Jesus' mission, as he chose to express it and as we've received it down through time, was based on agape. The gospel tells us how Jesus encouraged people to love one another unconditionally, even when it was difficult to do so. So I'm going to read you now. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's from the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says, "You have heard it said, you shall love," and I'm going to mangle the Greek, but try and listen for the distinction. Agape sysis, okay, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love, agapete, your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So while many forms of love can have the same characteristics, the traits of agape love are pretty unique. It's filled with kindness and only wants good for the other person to whom you're extending this love. It accepts people unconditionally, tough one, with no expectation of that love being reciprocated. It's another tough piece. It sacrifices for the good of other people, and it can sometimes be viewed as a thankless type of love, because there isn't usually, or doesn't need to be, an acknowledgement of that love. It's not envious, it's not proud, it's not boastful, and it's patient, giving other people the grace in case they don't receive your love the way you'd like them to. and it also doesn't hold grudges. It focuses on the similarities between people rather than on their differences, and it strives to find common ground. It treats other people with kindness, even when they're strangers. And over time, historically and in the early Christian community, agape came to be connected with a meal. But more importantly than a meal, a concept that's called open table ministry. Remember the story in the gospel when Jesus said, go out and gather people from the street. Just pull them in. Just, when they were trying to get people to sit, and some people didn't want to be at the front of the table because they didn't think they were good enough. He said, go out and call them all in. Bring them all in. We're going to feed them all. That open table ministry was a key to Jesus's living agape love. Agape is a way to love someone that accepts them and embraces them because we know that they're whole. Now, they may not know it. They may not express it. They may not see it. But we hold that vision for them. And as a church community, we do that for each other. We do that for each other when we're all struggling, and I can look into the eyes of a member of this congregation and know that they hold that vision for me. And hopefully, they can see that I hold that vision for them. So agape love is, in its way, very intimate because it strives to touch you at that point of vulnerability. And to do it even when the person may push you away, which is tough. If you're open and you're expressive and you're vulnerable and someone pushes you away, that's a hard place to keep. It's the hard place to stay, but it's what we're called to do. We don't live in an ideal world. If only. People are human, and even the most disciplined, selfless individuals have rough days. We all have rough days. But if you're striving in your heart of hearts, you have a goal to think of others, to be considerate, to be kind, to execute and exercise compassion. And if you're someone who really wants to show agape love, if you have that as your intention, it can have a positive effect, an impact on you physically. Doctors think that kind of openness will affect you physically, emotionally, and mentally in a healthy way. The practice of it improves your emotional well-being because it offers you a sense of deep connection, even if it's not reciprocated. Even if you sometimes think it's going only one way. I'm putting it out there, but it's not coming back. You get the benefit from it because you're living with an open heart. And we feel good. I know I do. I feel good when I can genuinely help someone else. That altruistic feeling shows up in many ways in our everyday lives. So it's in the popular pay it forward model. Where you're in a fast food line or in the line at Starbucks and you pay for the person behind you without their knowledge. My father used to pay the toll on the bridge for the person in the car behind. And that person would go out of their way to try and find out who was in that car. He got a kick out of it, but we always thought it was kind of dangerous. But it's a relatable example of agape as love in action. Okay. Watching a person in a grocery store in the line struggling to buy food and stepping up to provide payment with no motive other than wanting to help is a gesture that shows agape love. I was at Houston Food Bank earlier this week, and it was a crazy place. And the woman who's the director, she looked exasperated, and I asked her why, and she said because she was getting a lot of kickback from people that they only wanted to serve a meal on Christmas Day. And she looked at me and she said, I don't know how else to tell them that people are hungry every day. And so who are they feeding them for? Where is that coming from? It's not out of a gesture of love for the people they're feeding. It's because they need to feel good for something to do on Christmas to demonstrate. So remember that. Remember that the littlest gestures sometimes make the biggest impact. Something as simple as holding the door open for somebody behind you and smiling and chit-chatting can make a person's day. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be grand. You just have to start to do it. Just have to start. Putting aside what you're doing to listen to someone who's going through a hard time, who's lonely, who needs somebody to talk to. That is agape love. You don't have to have a solution. You don't have to have an answer. You don't even have anything to say. All you have to do is listen. And you've given the gift of love. When you extend that kind of generosity into your relationships, whether they're intimate relationships or family relationships or friendships, it has a revolutionary impact that goes way beyond you. Because people realize how good it feels, and then they might decide to try it out themselves. And it's got this ripple effect. The power of respectful acceptance. Think about that. When you accept somebody wherever they are, and you do it with love and you do it with respect, is a priceless gift. It beats anything you can stick under a tree. To give that kind of gift to another human being. And like they read today in the Daily Word, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So consider how Jesus loved us. Just think about that. How that baby's birth gets celebrated. And how it challenges us to show up. Jesus says that the ultimate standard of authentic love is how well you love the person you can't stand. Your enemy, or at least your biggest annoyance, if they're not your enemy. The earliest followers of Jesus who wrote the books of the New Testament in Greek, they didn't learn the meaning of agape love by going through some ancient dictionaries. Rather, they looked to the teachings of Jesus and the story of his life to redefine what agape meant. And it redefined the very concept of love and the way they lived their lives. For Jesus, love is action. It's not a feeling. Agape love is a verb. It is a doing. Agape love may involve emotion, and sometimes it's not a good emotion. I mean, it might be like anger and pissed off. And you do something in spite of that feeling, but it must always involve action. There is not agape love if it's not accompanied by action. It's a choice that you make to seek the well-being of other people ahead of yourself. Tough one. So I truly believe that this kind of generous love reflects the very heartbeat of God. Very heartbeat of God. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a contemporary martyr, he was a German Lutheran minister who was killed by the Nazis for his belief. But he says this kind of love brings gladness to the heart. Isn't it great? He doesn't even talk about what it does to other people who are on the receiving end. What it says is to your heart, you will be glad in your heart if you live this way. So the question is, and the question I put to you, church family, is how do we begin to really live the nativity story? How do we make it come to life? And how can it and we be relevant in the world that we live in? Decorations, presents, cookies, they're nice and they're fun. But what can we commit to as we look to strengthen and encourage one another? Because that's where we live. This is where we live as human beings. I'm going to read you a story. There are people in this community who are great storytellers, but I want to tell you, I'm not one of them. And I have this terrible thing where I'll start one story and I finish it with the end of a different story. And I do the same thing with jokes. So I'm going to read you this story. And the story is told of a child psychologist who spent many hours constructing a new driveway in his home. Just after he smoothed the surface of the freshly poured concrete, his small children chased a ball across the driveway, leaving deep footprints in the new concrete. The man yelled after them with a torrent of angry words. His shocked wife said, "You're a child psychologist. You're supposed to love children." The fuming man shouted out, "I love children in the abstract, but not in the concrete." I laughed at this story and I groaned at the play on words, but the story kind of rang true for me. While I agree in principle with the concept of self-giving love, I often find myself failing to express it, failing to live from it with the people that I'm around every day. You know, as a theory, agape love isn't worth very much. It's not worth very much. As a practice, it's one of the world's greatest treasures. So, I want you to know that I feel blessed to have you all in my life. And I know that we can carry the spirit of the Nativity story into this next year. Personally, each of us individually, and as a church family. Loving, celebrating, and serving. And so do I say Merry Christmas and Namaste.